pleasure to introduce Peter Mogielnicki, our guest speaker tonight. Peter has been a part-time resident of Quonnie for many years. I don't know how many, Peter. How many?
82.
82. He was here during the hurricane of 38. And has served on the QHS board for over 5 years. Peter is recognized for his long career in medicine and as an author and environmental advocate. Please welcome Peter Mogielnicki.
Thanks, it's still on? Okay, thanks. Can you hear me? Oh, good. Okay. So first, just an announcement. Tomorrow there'll be another bird-related event. This one's sponsored by, what, up here? That better? Yeah. All right. Tomorrow, Bill McNee, local expert bird photographer and birder, is going to be leading a bird walk at the Quonnie Breachway. There's still 2 spots left of the 20 that are going to be available. So after the talk today, if you check in with Bill, he's sitting in the back, and you can register for one of those 2 slots. We had an earlier one at the peak of the shorebird migration about a month ago, and it was fabulous. But most of the migrating birds have gone through, but I'm sure we'll see a lot of the resident birds. So before getting started, I want all of you to know from the onset that this talk would not have been possible without the help of expert birder Bill and image artist and drone pilot Bob Petrone, the saintly, patient, slide-making abilities of Bob's brother Peter Petrone, who couldn't be here tonight, but helped me a great deal in making some of the slides, and the generous technical help of Rich Wells, who is running all of this equipment and knows what he's doing with them, which I don't. So really appreciate all of those guys. And finally, I don't know if anybody from the Tamaquag Museum is here, but the Tamaquag Indigenous Peoples Museum up in Exeter is an amazing place, and they were very helpful in giving me some of their version of some of the earliest history of birds in Quonnecontog. And incidentally, this lovely photograph, which I think would make great wallpaper, was taken by Bob, and it's the one that we're starting the talk with. Anyway, I'd also like to explain from the onset that I will be using he, him when I talk about birds. And my reason for doing that is that most of the most colorful and recognizable forms of birds are the male birds. And they're also the singers most of the time because they're protecting their territory and they're trying to attract a mate. So I'll say he, him, but I mean birds in general. So in order to start today's talk with the earliest bit of history, as I said, I checked in with the Tamaquag Museum, and they were very helpful. And I'll start with some of the things that they told me. But first, to set the scene, I'd just like each of you to be as quiet as possible. Maybe even close your eyes, use your imagination, but listen to all the songs of birds that you can't hear, as though they aren't here. It's very quiet without birdsong. And we don't even have a siren to listen to, so I'm grateful for that. This is what the Tamaquag Museum told me. Back almost at the beginning of things, right after the Great Spirit, Katanawit, had created the earth and sea and all the creatures of the earth, the animals on the land, the fishes in the sea, and the birds in the sky, Katanawit noticed that something was missing because there was no bird song at the beginning, according to their history. So the Great Spirit called all the birds together at the Council Rock and announced a contest. The next morning, at sunrise, all the birds were to begin to fly upward. And as each flew as high as they could, Katanawit would give each one a song. And the bird that flew the highest would get the most beautiful song of all. The simplest songs would go to the birds that couldn't fly very high, like cowbirds and crows. They'd get very simple songs. But the ones that flew the highest would get the most beautiful song of all. So the next morning, as the contest was about to begin, the little thrush, we'll see a picture of one in a minute, was standing next to Wahumpsicuk, the eagle. And the thrush got really discouraged because he knew that the eagle was a very powerful flyer. And so he was sure that the eagle was going to get the most beautiful song. But then he had an idea, and Thrush jumped onto the eagle's back and hid in his neck feathers. Then they began to fly as high as they could. And one by one, the birds began to get exhausted and fall back. But the eagle, of course, the strong flyer that he is, kept flying higher and higher, and all the other birds dropped out. But Eagle wanted to show off, so he kept going higher until he finally got exhausted and couldn't fly any higher. At which point, Thrush hopped off his back, perfectly rested, flew even higher. Eagle couldn't keep up, went back to Earth, and Thrush was sure that he'd won. Eagle went back to Earth and knew he'd been beaten. So Thrush began to come back down to Earth and was expecting to have a crowd just thrilled and clapping and carrying on and congratulating him. And as he came down, he got his song. We got the next slide coming up. But as Thrush approached the council rock, he noticed that Eagle looked very angry, and there was no clapping and no celebration. And he knew that Eagle had told the other birds that that Thrush had cheated. So Thrush became very discouraged. He was ashamed of himself, didn't even go back to the council rock, went off into the dark forest where they continued to live to this day. We probably have a few thrushes in Quonnie, but they stay in the dark forest because they're ashamed to show their face, and they only sing at night. But they do have the most beautiful song, which they have continued to remember. Do we have another one of those? We do. Let's hear it. Very peaceful, gentle song. So as I said, nowadays, almost all of Quonnie Neck is lawns and manicured gardens. There's a little bit of strip in the middle, which has probably enough dark woods to be a good home for a thrush or two. But they're very hard to see. I've only seen one, and that was during migration, several years ago. Most people, they're just hard to see, but they have a lovely song. So the Tamaquag Museum staff also told me that their history says that the first Thanksgiving meal with the newcomers when they arrived from Europe included plenty of pigeons and waterfowl, as well as turkey. This is a rock dove, also known as a sky rat by some, but a common pigeon. And these birds were brought to the United States in about 1621 with the colonists. That hardly gives enough time for them to be common enough to be served at the first Thanksgiving. But what probably the Native Americans were serving them was this other bird. Anybody recognize this bird? What is it? Robin? Not quite. Huh? This is a passenger pigeon. This isn't a living passenger pigeon. This is a stuffed passenger pigeon, because the passenger pigeon became extinct some time ago. And I heard one person say maybe it was a robin, and it does look kind of like a robin because of its reddish breast. But if you look hard, it's got a very small head, and it is a passenger pigeon, a stuffed one anyway. So even though they're now extinct, at one time, they were all over the place in the United States. And Reverend Andrew Barnaby, in his book, Travels Through the Middle Settlements of North America in the years 1759 and 1760, wrote the following. During the course of my ride from Newport, I observed prodigious flights of wild pigeons. They directed their course southward, and the hemisphere was never entirely free of them. They are birds of passage, and are of beautiful plumages, and are excellent eating. I met scarcely any other food at the ordinaries where I put up, and the common people subsist almost wholly upon them during their flight. And this is in Rhode Island that this was going on. And ornithological historians have created, from records and whatnot, have created this map of the breeding range of passenger pigeons, the original breeding range. And the black area there is, if you look at it carefully, certainly probably includes Quonnie, and we probably were eating passenger pigeons here back in the 1600s. But according to an article in the Providence Journal in 1886, the last passenger pigeons were taken in Rhode Island by Walter Angel of Westerly. And 28 years later, in 1914, the last one died in the Cincinnati Zoo, and there hasn't been one seen since. Okay. The wild turkey, however, fared a little bit better. It was hunted aggressively for the market. Where are we here? Okay, yes. And a few years before that last passenger pigeon died, the wild turkey was declared extinct in Rhode Island. A few flocks persisted in the Appalachians, and the New England Historical Society website has a nice article that says that in the 1920s, wild turkeys had disappeared from 20 of the 39 states in which they had an original range. None existed east of the Connecticut River in the 1920s. But starting in the 1940s, taxes on firearms and increasing interest on the part of environmentalists and hunters led to the wild turkey being gradually reintroduced state by state, moving to the east. And finally, over several years in the 1980s, birds were gradually transplanted from Connecticut to Rhode Island. And today they're present in every county in Rhode Island, including Washington County. Has anybody ever seen a wild turkey here in Quonnie? Yeah, I've seen them. A lot of folks, they're out there, and they're interesting birds. As a matter of fact, to keep track of the population, the Department of Environmental Management, if you go to their website, is asking everybody who sees a turkey to report it, because they're trying to keep track of the population, and that's the best way they can do it, is just get citizens to report their sightings. Okay. But given Rhode Island's 400 miles of shoreline and extensive salt marshes, and its position on the Atlantic Flyway, waterfowl and shorebirds also provided plenty of dinner in the past, as well as becoming income generators for market hunters. And weapons like this one, and they used these, took their toll on the shorebirds. Predictably, there was a steady drop in the number of those birds. But in 1877, the Rhode Island General Assembly passed one of the very first game laws in the country. And it defined closed seasons, so you couldn't shoot the birds during certain breeding seasons. And they outlawed certain practices like the use of this kind of weapon, which is another weapon used to harvest shorebirds. I don't know if this happened in Quonnie, but it's one of the things that people used to bring home dinner and bring home their pay when they sold them to the market. Okay, next slide. So there was so much hunting and provision of shorebirds that lay periodicals like the Good Housekeeping magazine reported the prices in They're in their periodicals. Here's from the Good Housekeeping in 1886, seasonable table supplies gathered from from New York markets expressly for good housekeeping by Mrs. Benson, says fall turkeys yellow with fat with wing and tail feathers left on cost 25 cents a pound if they're from Rhode Island, and 18 a pound from Long Island. I don't know why Rhode Islands were better, but there you have it. Plover, and this will give some real birders a headache, plover were 25 cents a piece, yellow legs $1.50 a dozen, large yellow legs 30 cents, dowitchers 15 cents, small birds, robins, you name it, you know, $1 a dozen, etc. So this was common dinners in the whole Northeast, shorebirds. Okay, next slide. Anybody recognize this bird? It's a tough one. Willet, good for you. Yes, we got good birders out there. For those of you who aren't wild about birds, this is about, let's see, foot long, weighs 8 to 12 inches, 8 to 12 ounces. And today, as anybody who goes down to the Breachway knows, you can almost count on seeing or at least hearing one of these because they're very noisy and they have a very characteristic sound. It's piercing, it's a loud noise, and this is what you hear when you take a walk to the Breachway. But the decline in shorebirds in the early 1900s led this distinguished gentleman, who happens to have been the state ornithologist of Massachusetts, wrote this about the willet. The willet has lately deserted many of its former haunts. It's vanished as a breeding bird not only from Nova Scotia and New England, but also from the Atlantic coast north of Virginia. So they were just gone. Now they're all over the place. Well, supplying waterfowl and shorebirds for food wasn't the only kind of market hunting. Feathers of birds have been used for centuries as a mark of power and prestige. This is Gundekar, Prince of Liechtenstein in 1667. Quite a few feathers, making him look really outstandingly important. Maybe he's trying to scare his enemies into thinking he's a bird of prey. Maybe he's trying to impress his sweetheart. Here's someone who may be his sweetheart, getting her hair done. Feathers all over the place. Very important if you were an important person back then. But in the 1800s, feathers somehow became a status symbol even for the middle class. And it became a real important part of income for some folks. Let's see, what's the date here? 1903, the price of egret plumes was $32 an ounce, or about $1,000 an ounce in today's dollars. And next, and here's, the plume hunters didn't have themselves photographed very often. This is one that I could find. And if you look carefully, which is going to be hard to see, those white blobs in the background are probably egrets. And they were a very popular source of the plumes for folks who wanted to impress their neighbors, I guess. Okay. But macho hunters weren't the only guys who were responsible for, or who were thought to be responsible for market hunting for feathers. This is a slide from Punch magazine in 1911. And it places some of the blame on women for birds being slaughtered. But also, if you look carefully, these guys in the background, they're two dogs serving as retrievers, and they're labeled French milliners. So it was a real collaboration to provide these feathers for the fashions of the day. The slide also makes the point that the most desirable hunting of birds for their plumes took place during the breeding season when they had their finest feathering. And up in the corner, there's some young egrets. And what the cartoon makes a point that the parents are being slaughtered and the young will eventually starve to death because there's nobody to feed them. About 20 years before this cartoon, in 1886, a fellow named Frank Chapman, who was the first curator of birds at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, had taken a walk up 14th Avenue in Manhattan. And on that walk, he counted 174 different species of birds, including woodpeckers, orioles, bluebirds, blue jays, terns, egrets, vultures, eagles, swans, herons, turkeys, and owls, all in the middle of Manhattan, and all on women's hats. Here's a photograph of opera singer Emmy Dess. She's decked out in her finest. My guess is, and this may or may not be the case, but I'm guessing that maybe those white feathers on her hat were from these birds. And anybody want to guess? The one over here? Snowy egret. The one over there? Great egret. So snowy's very characteristic, yellow feet and a dark stiletto bill, which doesn't show up too well. Great egret, good deal bigger, not a dark black bill, but sort of a heavier duty bill, some color. You can't see its feet, unfortunately, in this slide, but they're black, not yellow, which are very distinctive on a snowy egret. Oh dear. Okay. By the end of the 19th century, however, both the snowy and the great egret were considered near extinction in the whole country. But then, enter Harriet Augustus Hemingway, Boston socialite and apparent bird lover. After reading a newspaper article about the slaughter of entire rookeries of wading birds for women's hats, Harriet, this painting, by the way, is John Singer Sargent. Harriet called together some of her friends. They had tea parties in Boston. The High Society of Boston had tea parties. And she educated them about what was going on to fulfill the need for flowers, for feathers for her hats, for their hats. And they talked it up, and they got on their high dudgeon, and together, a couple of years later, in 1896, founded the first Audubon Society in the country. It happened to be in Massachusetts, but that was the beginning of the whole Audubon Society thing, thanks to Harriet. Shortly thereafter, 2 years later in Rhode Island founded its Audubon Society, and then shortly thereafter, a whole bunch of other states founded individual state Audubon societies, and eventually, as you know, a national Audubon Society was formed. The early 1900s saw Audubon societies really developing some lobbying clout. Maybe it was the money behind the high society that did it, but the US Congress, shortly thereafter, passed the Migratory Bird Treaty in 1918, which basically made it illegal to hunt any migratory bird except for ducks, geese, and woodcock. Nonetheless, many of our shorebird hunting for the market did continue. These are US Fish and Wildlife agents in 1930, a good several years after the Migratory Bird Act was passed, and these are egret plumes that they had seized in 1930, very proudly showing their skills at arresting the bad guys. In spite of that, many of our shorebirds did make dramatic recoveries, to the point that now it's almost impossible to take a walk to the breachway without seeing those beautiful egrets as well as other shorebirds, but some did become extinct. A couple of curlews never made it past the market hunters, and now we don't get to see them at all. One group of birds which didn't recover promptly after the passage of the Migratory Bird Treaty was birds of prey, which had been hunted down for years, not for their plumes, but because they were viewed as pests and varmints and chicken hawks. At the onset of World War II, a chemical which had first been synthesized by an Austrian chemist in 1874 was discovered to have insecticidal properties in 1939, and that chemical, of course, was DDT. That actually brings us to a point in history that some of us in this room, myself included, can remember. Nowadays, most of us think of malaria as a tropical disease. But back in the 19th century, it was reasonably common in the United States. Here's a slide. This was collected from data of troop bivouacs or camps, military camps, and they would report every case of malaria that they had in their military camp. And even though most malaria was centered down in the south, you can sort of see that even up as far as Long Island, and if it was on Long Island, you would think that at least it probably included southern, if it was on Long Island, it probably included southern Long Island. So we had malaria here, almost certainly, back then. Next slide. There was a lot of effort made to eradicate mosquitoes. These are civilian Conservation Corps workers. They're digging ditches in the salt marshes to drain the salt marshes so that there was no place for the mosquitoes to breed. And anybody who's tromped the marshes at our breachway can still see evidence of that hard work. Up by the arrow, there's some long sort of lines. Here's the breachway. There's the parking area of the DEM fishing area. There's the spit that we go out. That's actually the spit that Bill McNee will take birders out to tomorrow morning. And this photograph was taken just recently by Bob Patrone with his drone, showing that those ditches that the CCC were digging by hand to get rid of mosquitoes are still there. Okay. So this sort of segues to a brief personal digression, during which we'll transition from the past to the present. I've been coming to Quonnie every summer except for COVID since '41. It was here that I first was introduced to birds. Our family would come down as soon as school was out. My dad would be here weekends. I'd be here with my mom throughout the rest of the summer. Great time, except there weren't a lot of kids around back then. There weren't many children, no playmates. So my mother came up with a trick. She would nail a bottle cap to the wooden window boxes outside our window, fill it with peanut butter, and birds would come. And so I would sit there watching the birds, especially on rainy days. Next slide. If you were going to do that today, I imagine these would be the birds that would show up. Starlings and English sparrows. Very common. Back then, we never saw one. They just weren't in Quonnie. What we did see was this bird. Anybody recognize it? Gray catbird. Good. Yeah. So this is a gray catbird. And let me get to the next page. And they would come to the peanut butter caps. And fortunately, we still have plenty of these guys. And they'd probably compete with the English sparrows and the starlings pretty well. We have lots of them. So most songbirds make at least two different kinds of sounds. This is a catbird, and they make a warning sound, and they make a song. They make a more lyrical song. When there's danger around, or when somebody's approaching their nest, whoops, that's not a catbird. There we go. All right, the catbird will make a call reflective of its name. You okay? You still there? Give us the catbird. Well, it's the computer that's having a problem. Well, that doesn't sound like a call. So. Anyway, that's its call. Very short, not at all anything like a melody. And this is its song. Very different. Same bird. One, it's upset. The other one, it's probably trying to impress its girlfriend or tell other male catbirds to get out of the way. Okay, now we can go. So here's another bird that sort of straddles the past and the future. But unlike the catbird, which is native, mute swans are not natives, and they were first brought to the U.S. in about the mid-1800s, and they were brought here to decorate ponds of estates, and then they were imported to a lot of public parks. And from the public parks, they kind of spread up and down the East Coast to the point that they almost became a problem. They have very long necks. They can reach the bottom easily, a lot more easily than our native waterfowl. They're pretty aggressive, and they're strong. And what was observed was as the swan population grew, the population of our native waterfowl dropped. And as a result, the Department of Environmental Management, when they noticed this going on, said, we got to do something, and they began to control the swans' population. They did this by either addling the eggs, finding the nest, shaking the eggs, or putting oil on the eggs, or sometimes having controlled hunts. And as a result of the DEM's efforts, the swan population sort of stabilized. And here's a recent article in the East Bay, Rhode Island News. DEM calls off the Little Compton swan hunt this year. Briggs Marsh still has 100 to 200 mute swans in it. And the article goes on to say that they were planning to do this hunt, but then there was so much public outcry that they called it off. So it's still an active issue. And somebody, you told me, Joan, that you had just seen a swan somewhere on the pond, Quonnie Pond? Yeah. So they are around, and you sometimes bump into them. From the time I started coming to Quonnie until the late 70s or early 80s, I never saw this bird. I think most of you will recognize it's an osprey. Thankfully, a sort of a bureaucratic U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service publications editor named Rachel Carlson published a book in 1972 called Silent Spring. And she called attention to research which had already been actively being done that showed pretty definitively that DDT was causing birds of prey who are at the top of the food chain, concentrate things like DDT all the way up the food chain. Their eggs develop very thin shells and break before the young ever hatch. So the birds of prey really disappeared, not because of market hunting, not because of plumes, but because of DDT being present in their prey. Amazingly, it's hard to believe that in 1967, the population of ospreys in Rhode Island was down to 1 or 2 nesting pairs in northern Narragansett Bay. Now, between the time they get here in April or early May and the time they leave in October, ospreys can be seen by almost any beachgoer who's not looking at his cell phone, but actually looking at what's going on outside there. And almost daily, these fishhawks entertain us, folding their wings, plummeting down from as high as 120 feet, hitting the water at between 30 and 50 miles an hour, and coming up with a fish they can actually carry about one time out of every 9 dives. So they got to work at it, but they do it. Amazingly, watching this performance doesn't cost us a cent. Of the 4 other birds of prey which regularly visit or breed in Quonnie, 3 of them give us a real thrill to see. This one, you don't see it very often just sitting there. You'll usually see it zoom past your window very fast, or maybe stake out your bird feeder, because they mainly eat songbirds and small mammals. This is a tough call. Anybody want to give it a shot? Cooper's hawk. Somebody said Cooper's hawk? Cooper's hawk. Yep. Very aggressive, fast-moving bird of prey that took a hit when it came to DDT. Here's another bird, which certainly is worth getting up as close as you can. I was fishing one fall on the rocks between Little Nuns Beach and Central Beach, and I came upon this bird sitting on the stair rail of the Van Elslender's, am I pronouncing that right? Van Elslender's house. This is the stairway down towards the rocks. And I don't know whether you can see it. It's not the same kind of quality photograph that we've been looking at. But there are 2 little sideburns on each side of this bird's head. It's about, 15 inches long. And this is a peregrine falcon, I'm pretty sure. I'm sorry? Peregrine falcon, migrating down. And I was trying to get as close as I could, taking this picture with my little cell phone. I got this close, and it took off, flew off across the surf side, and I suspect was headed towards the Quonnie marshes to find its supper of shorebirds, because they're aggressive hunters, as you can imagine. Okay. And there's another bird which Joan and I were just talking about, is this one, which doesn't need much of an introduction. Our national bird almost disappeared as a result of DDT. Now see it pretty regularly in Quonnie, either cruising the pond or just flying overhead. I don't know if there's a breeding record of bald eagles in Rhode Island. Bill, do you know? We got a breeding record in.
I don't have that. Maybe Barbara might.
Yeah. Yes.
There are. There's 5.
There's one over in Avondale.
So they're in Rhode Island.
Yeah, they've been over near in Mogielnicki.
Oh, Mogielnicki. Okay, but not in Quonnie.
Situate Reservoir has 2 nests.
Oh,
The immediate forest in Rhode Island has a nest.
okay.
So there's about 5 nests in Rhode Island.
Okay, so they're around. We just need one on Quonnie.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife goes up and wears helmets and tags all the babies.
Aha, with helmets.
With helmets.
Yeah, good. Okay, so I said there were 4 birds that came back from DDT. 3 of them give us a thrill. This one sometimes doesn't give us a thrill. Anybody want to shout it out? All right, double-crested cormorant. These are controversial birds. They are really very aggressive feeders. They're here in enormous numbers. And there's a lot of concern that they just eat too many fish. And also, importantly, that they have droppings which are loaded with nitrogen, and along with the nitrogen that's coming from lawns being fertilized, all of which drains into the ponds, causes big mats of algae, because it's a great fertilizer. Algae lives for a while and then dies, sinks to the bottom, and smothers the clams and other critters that live in the mud. And so there's a lot of concern about what ought to be done. Of course, they're protected by the Migratory Bird Act. There still is a lot of concern about what ought to be done by the numbers of cormorants that we have. So 3 birds of prey that we all look forward to seeing, and this one, not so much. Okay. So another bird which has been pulled back from the brink of extinction is this one. Anybody call it? Piping plover. Yeah, good. The drop in piping plover's population had nothing to do with DDT or with overhunting, but instead has been related to the increasing use of beaches by us humans and our pets. It turns out that these gentle things their preferred nesting site is at the high tide mark of a nice sandy beach, for which there's a certain amount of competition. Next slide. So, as I said, they like the high tide. This isn't a sandy beach, it's a little pebbly, but they're sort of minimalist architects when it comes to nesting. Anybody want to spot the nest over there? Yeah, upper left. 2 eggs. Are you going to see it? 2 eggs and a sort of a scoop. So not much of a nest. Easy to step on, easy to miss. And presumably it's because of that their population became so endangered. There are 2 populations of piping plovers, one in the Great Lakes and one here on the Atlantic coast. Both populations were considered endangered until very recently. The Great Lakes population is on the endangered species list. A couple of years ago, the East Coast population was downlisted or uplisted, I don't know which one, but anyway, changed to threatened, not entirely endangered. But still, DEM, you may have seen one of these or a variation of it. The Department of Environmental Management in Rhode Island recruits volunteers in April and May to go looking for nests like that. And when they find them, put a protective cage around them and warn people that that's what it is, keep their dogs away. And it also, incidentally, keeps away other predators like raccoons and foxes. Okay. So, yeah, a year or 2 after I came across the peregrine falcon I showed you earlier, that is the next one. Okay. I arrived at the breachway on a walk to the fishing area. And I came across a very agitated gentleman yelling, screaming, waving his arms, and it turned out he was trying to scare away a raptor which was chasing a little shorebird. So, where am I here? Lost my page. Eventually, the shorebird that it was chasing hid under this fellow's truck. I took this picture. It was there, I swear it. The raptor was swooping around his truck, disappointed that he hadn't caught this bird. Eventually, the fellow continued to scream and yell. Off went what I'm pretty sure was a peregrine. And the gentleman reached under his truck, picked up the piping plover, turned around, released it, and said, "Have a good trip." That's what happened. So, interesting things happen when you're looking for birds. Another bird whose population has increased during the past few years is the one up in the upper left. Anybody want to give it a guess? Mockingbird? No, yes, northern mockingbird. Where are we here? Oh, the mockingbird, like the catbird, is a member of the mimic family of birds. And the difference is, aside from their coloration, the mockingbird's song, while it is variable and musical, is much more sort of harmonic and much more musical than the catbird's. Catbird's is kind of raspy, as you heard. Mockingbirds are much more melodic, if that's the right word. goes on and on and on. Okay. Yeah. Kind of obsessed with singing. I think we can stop. That's good. So there's some evidence to suggest that female mockingbirds actually favor mates who have the ability to mimic the largest number of different songs. So the better they sing, the more likely they are to continue their genes. And ornithologists, some really enthusiastic ornithologists, have actually tried to count the number of different songs a different mockingbird can sing, and the best estimates are between 150 and 200 different songs that a single mockingbird can kind of mimic. It's pretty amazing. They've also been recorded reproducing a squeaking gate and a car alarm, so they can do a good job. So, as I was saying, mockingbirds are quite common here in Quonnie now. But back in the 1920s, a sighting was rare enough that it merited reporting in a premier scientific ornithological journal called Auk. And this is a quote from Auk. Mr. Horace Wright says he was sent a communication from Mr. Harry Hathaway in which Mr. Hathaway quotes Dr. Edward Lewis. So this is kind of not firsthand evidence, but apparently respected birders, in which Mr. Hathaway quotes Dr. Lewis, June 24th, 1917. I saw a mockingbird in bushes beside the road at Dunn's Corners, westerly. It flew to a telephone wire where it stayed for a few minutes and gave me a good opportunity for examination. I didn't see it again in this locality, although I visited it on several occasions a week apart looking for it. So it's hard to imagine that seeing a mockingbird today near Dunn's Corners would even get a second glance from anybody. But back then it was worth reporting. I didn't see a mockingbird here until the 50s or 60s, but today they're really quite common. They didn't suffer because of DDT or plume hunting. They weren't very fancy plumes. The thought is that they disappeared for a number of reasons. One, they're tremendous singers, and they thought they were just caught. People would pay a lot of money to get a mockingbird, so they thought they were captured for that purpose. There was a market for them. They were also thought to be agricultural pests, and they disappeared. Maybe the climate changed or whatever the reason was. They more or less disappeared from the Northeast, but then back in the 50s and the 60s started coming back, and now they're pretty much all over the place. They remained a common bird in the South, and whether it's climate change that has moved them back or some other reason, I don't think has been very well established. The same is true for the other three birds on this slide: tufted titmouse, cardinal, northern cardinal, and Carolina wren. We didn't used to see those here. Now, perhaps because it's a little bit warmer, they all are fairly common in Quonnecontog. So I've touched on only a few of the many birds passing through Quonnie Neck. And I've left, if anybody's interested, I've left a copy of my own personal best collection since I got here and can remember, back on the back table. If anybody wants to take a copy, they're welcome to it. And if we run out and you really want one, leave your name on the sheet of paper and I'll send you one electronically. Okay, next slide. Two amazing resources you might want to pursue if you're interested in this kind of thing have only recently been published. The one here was published by DEM and the University of Rhode Island in 2023, and it basically documents the breeding birds in Rhode Island pretty conclusively. The other book, which came out so recently that I just got a copy of it about a week before this talk, is this thing. It weighs about, 15 pounds. It is an amazing tome. I think you used that word, Joan. written by a couple of professors of ornithology and ecology. It is called Birds of Rhode Island, Seasonal Distribution and Ecological History. I'll leave it on the back table if anybody wants to browse it. This is the library's copy, so it's the only one I could get my hands on. And if I had had this book when I started to put this talk together, it would have been easy to do this research because it documents almost every sighting of every bird in Rhode Island. Some of the quotes are actually from Roger Williams. I saw such and such a bird, and it's amazing, as Joan can attest. Okay. Good. Yeah, we have both of these books now for Rhode Island. We don't have any systematic record of birds nesting in Quonnie. And maybe that's something that the Quonnecontog Conservation Collaborative will take on. I think it would be a kind of a good thing to do now, and then have it around 50 years from now and see if the same birds are still nesting here. Okay. So that's a good sort of segue to move into the future of birds. Next slide. It's always a little risky. It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. I think that's true, but I'm going to try it anyway, just to make some, guesses. I think one thing you could probably say is true, and that the birds in Quonnie in the future is probably going to be somewhat different than the birds in Quonnie now. Things are probably going to change one way or the other. And that is going to depend largely on the behavior of another species, Homo sapiens. A lot of it's in our hands, and it's in our hands both at the individual level and in the institutional level. One of the groups of birds that really has an uncertain future is the migratory shorebirds. This is a ruddy turnstone, but this bird, and as well as a number of other shorebirds, came back after the market hunting was cut back. But whether the rebound continues is going to be determined largely, for the shorebirds, by what happens to our salt marshes. If ocean levels continue to rise faster than the marshes can adapt, or the algae overgrowth from fertilizer runoff smothers the mudflats, many of these shorebirds won't be here anymore. We won't be able to see them. And even if those threats are brought under control, there are some very special threats, that one of which, at least, I find really interesting. Next slide. This is a tough one. It looks like a robin, I'll tell you that. It's got a red breast. And its name sort of reflects its redness. Any guesses? The red knot. Somebody said red knot? Yeah, this is a red knot. We see them regularly at Quonnie. This bird is one of the longest migrating creatures, land creatures, in the world. It spends the winters in Tierra del Fuego. It breeds in the northern Arctic, and it makes this journey with only a couple of stops for refueling along the way. 9,000 miles up, 9,000 miles back. The source of the great majority of the red knot's refueling is this creature. Whoops, oh no, whoop, back, let's go back. Yeah, this is what's happened to the red knot population since 1983. This is from aerial surveys of the birds that have been collected in Delaware Bay. The same phenomenon happens up here, although it hasn't been as formally studied. They do stop in our salt marshes. they've been seen every year. We still see a few coming through. But back in 1983, the aerial survey found 95,000. Back now in 2021, down to 6,880. So a really dramatic decline. So as I said, the source of these birds' major food comes from their stops in the salt marshes. Next slide. And it all depends on the eggs that horseshoe crabs lay, because horseshoe crabs lay millions of eggs. They're very rich in protein, they're very rich in fats, and they are the major food that red knots and other sandpipers, for that matter, use as they make stops in our breachways. But here's the catch. It's been discovered that horseshoe crab blood is the only source of a chemical which can be used in laboratory tests to detect bacteria contamination of your bloodstream and of vaccines. Every batch of vaccine that's made now is tested with a chemical from horseshoe crab blood. That was discovered in the 1970s, and it was when that became much more commonly used that the population of horseshoe crabs fell, and the population of red knots, I don't know about that, red knots, followed the fall in the population of horseshoe crabs. We're going to lose our tax exempt status if I keep this. All right. All right. So the bottom line, not quite yet, Rich, not quite yet. Let's go back there. There's the horseshoe crab. So there's so much demand for horseshoe crab blood that you can now get $15,000 a quart from drug companies that want to purify this chemical out of their blood and put in their vaccines. And not only that, but it turns out that crushed horseshoe crabs are one of the best baits for whelk traps. And horseshoe crabs are still harvested for whelk bait today. As a matter of fact, in Virginia, you can get $1.50 each for the bigger females and 65 cents each for the smaller males. So the bottom line is that horseshoe crab eggs have become fewer. Fewer horseshoe crab eggs leads to more poorly nourished nesting knots. Poorly nourished nesting knots, let's try saying that better. Poorly nourished nesting knots make fewer eggs. Fewer nestlings, nesting knots, don't survive to adulthood, and the population of nesting knots, of knots overall, is dropping. So the next time you get a vaccine, thank the horseshoe crabs and apologize to the knots. Okay, now we'll see that next slide. So, everybody can read the caption there? There we go. Okay, unlike birds of prey or shorebirds, passerines, which are also known as our songbirds, not in the raptor family, not in the shorebird family, sort of songbirds, also called passerines, are the birds you see most every day in your backyard. Many of them are exclusively insect eaters, and at least the young of nearly all of them, even the seed eaters, are dependent on insects when they're hatched. So caterpillars are the major source of most newborn chicks in nests, no matter of passerines, songbirds. There's a fellow in Ohio, he's a columnist. He describes caterpillars as nature's hot dogs, thin-skinned, full of protein and essential fats. They probably taste good too. And the future of songbirds in Quonnie, and worldwide for that matter, is very dependent on the future of bugs. This was, I think, 5 or 6 years ago, the cover of the New York Times Magazine. Pretty dramatic headline: "The insect apocalypse is here." And it's been very well documented. And somebody was talking to me about this earlier, that insects in general are in significant decline worldwide. I can go into some of the evidence afterwards if people are interested. But given that, you'd predict that songbird populations have also declined, and that's exactly what's being observed. Back in 2019, the New York Times said over the previous 50 years, prior to 2019, the bird population of the US and Canada was estimated to have dropped by 3 billion individuals, which was a 30% drop during that 50-year period. And the consensus among scientists is that much of this loss is the result of the decline in insects, though other factors like habitat disappearance, wandering cats, and window strikes, and climate change are also in the mix somewhere. So in general, it makes sense that the bird population is dropping. You know, this is a bird up in heaven who wonders if the angel there also bumped into a window. Makes sense bird populations in general are dropping, but there is a growing awareness of the relationship between insects and birds, and how the indiscriminate use of pesticides may be contributing to it, because nearly every pesticide, as you probably know, isn't very selective and will kill nearly every insect that it comes in contact with. Still, the temptation to hire a pest control company is pretty great. One thing individuals can do is to scrupulously avoid any standing water in their yard. I think a 1/4 inch of water can be a place where mosquitoes lay their eggs. And then within 8 days from the time an egg is laid, the egg can become an adult 8 days later. So it's worth your while, if you don't want to get bitten by a mosquito, to get rid of every little standing water there is that you can find in your yard. Tick control is another issue, however. It's not as easy to get rid of those. Next slide. One possibility is to stock your yard with peacocks. They have an appetite for ticks. Guinea hens do. Turkeys like ticks. And so do possums. So they're all things that are on our side. But stocking your yard with these is probably a little impractical, and possums are terrible pets. So I don't know what to suggest. Flowers like chrysanthemums and marigolds and herbs like sage, rosemary, and parsley are thought to deter ticks. And the Consumer Reports, when you look at how to control ticks, says if you make a moat around your lawn with wood chips, at least the ticks that spread Lyme disease don't like to cross dry wood chips, and so you may cut down the population that way. So the future of one particular songbird that nests on Quonnie Neck is this salt marsh sparrow. Hard to identify, pretty nondescript bird, but there's an interesting little story behind it. They're plain, they're hard to spot, they tend to be secretive, they live near the salt marsh, that's their name, salt marsh sparrows, and in our salt marsh, and they nest at ground level in salt marshes, and for some reason they like to nest right near the high tide line. Next slide. So here they are, here's a nest on the salt marsh, right in the salt marsh grass. They actually tend to nest on a 23 to 24 day cycle, timed to fall just between our extreme high tides. So if everything works out right, they nest at the high tide line, the babies hatch, before the next very high tide, next moon tide, the babies are gone and everything's okay. On the other hand, if things do not go well, this is the terrible thing that can happen. And with our bigger storms, and if the wind is blowing the wrong direction, salt marsh sparrows have a hard time surviving. But all of the future of birds in Quonnie is not doom and gloom. Next slide. Anybody want to identify this bird? We don't see them a lot. It's a glossy ibis, yes. They're becoming a good deal more common in the Northeast. I think they used to be more of a southern bird, but their population is expanding in the Northeast. Next slide. And up on top was the population in 1960, and you can see that the dark nesting areas barely makes it to Long Island. So there were a few back here in the 60s, but the lower slide, that dark area, clearly goes all the way up to Maine. So they seem to be moving their range further to the north, and they're reasonably common nowadays. So in summary, if one does want to take a stab at predicting the future of birds in Quonnie, I think one thing is safe. It's going to change. Some species will likely shrink. Some may disappear entirely. Others, currently restricted to the southern coast, will probably move up and take their place. In balance, the situation can be a little discouraging, though each of us can do something to keep this place as special as it is. Minimize the amount of lawn on your properties, plant native shrubs, trees that'll maximize the number of caterpillars. Try to avoid fertilizers that will inevitably, no matter where you are, end up draining into the pond. Avoid pesticides to the extent that you can. Keep your cats indoors, and do what you can to minimize window strikes. And if you really want to go whole hog, get a peacock. Next slide. And again, this presentation couldn't have been possible without the slide-making wizardry of Bob's brother, Peter Petrone, the outstanding bird photography of Bill McNee, most of which you saw today, the generous technical help of Rich Wells here, the oral historians of the Tamaqua Indigenous Museum in Exeter, and the photographic artistry, which we all know, and now the drone piloting of Bob Petrone. And thank you for coming.